Hello and welcome to my channel. Vice Rhino here. Today I'm looking at a video from none other than the creationist who is even a pariah among creationists, Kent Hovind. I haven't covered any of his material since he, whacked me.
There's a lot of stuff on the internet. You guys should look up Google, Googl.
I am smart. S-M-R-T.
But I figured it's been a while, and I also thought it was worth reminding people that the only reason he is not currently in prison is because he's waiting for his appeal trial. This video is called 6 Evidences, of YEC with Kent Hovind. So we'll see what he brings to the table for this and find out if he has any actual, new material. And also, just as a general principle now, thanks to some new copyright claims that have been popping up on my channel, I've decided that going forward, all videos will be inset rather than full screen, and if the person I'm responding to uses music, then I will run it through a music removal thing before publishing it. And since Hovind hired Matt Powell to wear matching outfits with him, as well as occasionally do technology stuff, this video has Powell's signature over-the-top dramatic music playing in the background. So I took it out. That's just how it is now. You can thank Answers in Genesis for this decision, which realistically I probably should have done proactively ages ago anyway. So on to the video.
Hi folks, my name's Kent Hovind. I was a high school science teacher 15 years, and I love studying about the Bible and what the Bible teaches in regard to science.
The Bible teaches nothing in regards to science. Now, the Bible does make statements that can be scientifically tested, but it doesn't actually teach anything scientific. And when it makes statements that can be scientifically tested, it usually gets them wrong. Not always, but usually.
God said very clearly that he made everything in 6 days. Now, how could you show the age of the earth?
There are a lot of ways. The most accurate is with the radiometric dating of material that formed at the same time as the solar system, such as meteors. But how do you know they formed at the same time? Well, we have good reason for thinking that they did, but hypothetically here, even if they didn't, creationists still have to deal with the fact that we've found 4.5 billion-year-old rocks in a world that is supposed to be 6,000 years old. But also time constraints have been put on the Earth using other methods well before radiometric dating was ever developed. Using geology, we were able to figure out that the Earth was at least 100 million years old in the 1800s. That was done with the observation of the rock cycle. Understanding how rocks form, it became clear that the Earth had to be at least that old, with some estimates stating that there was no upper age limit. It was thought that the rock cycle might be an eternal cycle, giving an infinitely old Earth. That was wrong, of course, but my point here is that just an understanding of geology gives us a minimum age for the Earth that is several orders of magnitude older than the oldest acceptable age for young Earth creationists, and we can get there through multiple methods.
I think the very best evidence of what some people call a young earth is God said he did it in 6 days and nothing died until Adam sinned, and Jesus said that was the beginning of the creation.
Okay, so your best evidence for a young Earth is that your specific interpretation of a demonstrably flawed book insists on a young Earth, therefore the Earth is young. Starting strong here.
So the best evidence of a young earth is the Bible. The Bible, certainly the dates in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, clearly add up to about 6,000 years for the total age of the earth, 4,000 BC.
Yeah, well, according to the Sumerian kings list, there were 5 kings who ruled for a total of 241,200 years before the flood swept over. And that's just in the opening paragraph. So clearly the Earth has to be much older than 241,200 years. Either that, or maybe ancient and unreliable genealogies that tie people back to mythical figures are not a great method for dating the Earth? I'm going to go with the second option there and just not rely on ancient genealogies as a dating method for the planet.
That's never been refuted.
I don't know, I think it kind of refutes itself. You know, with the whole people live to be way older than it's possible for people to live thing? Hell, even if we take the mythology seriously and say there was some way these people could have all lived to these silly old ages, it refutes itself when you read it in conjunction with Genesis 3, where God tells Adam that he would die on the day he ate the fruit. Adam ate the fruit, and then went on to live another 900 years or so. Both of those things cannot be true. But of course, that is conveniently where young Earth creationists start taking the story as metaphor or allegory rather than literal, talking about how Adam was to die a spiritual death, not a physical one, and so on that day he died a spiritual death. Which raises even more questions. The way death is talked about in the New Testament, when it's talking about spiritual rather than physical death, it's talking about going to hell. Future Rhino cutting in with a clarification. The Bible never actually explicitly talks about a spiritual death. That is an inference made by modern Christians. In fact, a good argument could be made that a spiritual death would have been a nonsensical concept to the authors of the Bible. Often when they're talking about heaven and hell, they talk about it as though it is a physical place that you go to with your physical body. Mark 9:43, for instance, better to live your life with one hand than to have two hands and go to hell. But that's another topic. If it's one that interests you, I'd recommend Bart Ehrman's book, Heaven and Hell. Back to you, Past Rhino. So, if we assume that this is a spiritual death in Genesis 3, then to keep things consistent in the Bible, Adam would have had to go to hell on the day he ate the fruit. Another interpretation is that this is when death was brought into the world, but again that leaves us with questions. If there wasn't death in the world, then what was the purpose of the Tree of Life? According to Genesis 3:22, the Tree of Life allows anyone who eats from it to live forever. Why is such a tree needed in a garden where death doesn't exist in the first place? If death did not exist, then the Tree of Life would be entirely pointless. It also, of course, doesn't say in the day you eat of it, death will enter the world, or things will start to die, or anything like that. It says in the day you eat of it, you shall surely die. So we're left with two options here. Either the genealogies are wrong, or God was lying in Genesis 2:17. I mean, I guess we're left with three options. It could just not be true at all, but I don't think you want to consider that one now, do ya?
Some people don't want to believe that.
You can project all you want, but when you take a demonstrably untrue statement like the genealogies in the Bible tell us the age of the earth, and then claim that it has never been refuted when literally dozens, if not hundreds of scientific fields of study refute it on a daily basis, you're showing that you are choosing to believe what you like instead of actually, following the science.
But the best evidence, I think, of what they call, I don't think 6,000 is young. I think that's pretty old, but
young and old are non-specific relative labels that we apply to things. They mean different things in different contexts. If I'm talking about a cat, then 20 years old is pretty old. If I'm talking about a human, then 20 years old is pretty young. So when speaking of the Earth, because it is demonstrably older than 4 billion years, to say that it is only 6,000 years old is to say that it is really, really young.
best evidence of a 6,000-year-old Earth is the Bible itself. But then you can look at almost any branch of science. You can look at the science of living things, biology, and you'll see that the population of the Earth today is growing, but if you can do the math and go backwards in time, you can make everybody on the planet from 8 people getting off of Noah's Ark 4,500 years ago.
Wow. Okay, well, there's a lot wrong here. First, the study of population growth, or anything to do with population dynamics really, is demography, not biology. So the fact that you don't even know what branch of science you are currently talking about tells us that, well, you don't know what you're talking about. Second, being able to do the math to get us back to a population of 8 people 4,500 years ago is actually quite irrelevant. Because in order to do this math, you have to make some pretty wild assumptions. Things like a constant population growth rate for humanity. Not only is this a faulty assumption, but we actually know for a fact that it is wrong. We've been measuring populations for long enough now that we've seen some pretty drastic swings in population growth rate. In Canada, for instance, we hit a growth rate of 2.81% in the 1950s, but are now at the lowest it has been since then, with a current growth rate of 0.86%. I imagine both of these values would yield drastically different results if extrapolated as constants over 4,500 years. But of course, creationists don't do actual growth rate calculations. Typically they try to figure out how long it takes for a population to double, and usually come up with a rather arbitrarily determined 150 years. They then calculate that a doubling from 8 people every 150 years takes about 4,500 years to get close to the population that we have today. And if the Earth was actually billions of years old, then using this doubling time, the population of the Earth would exceed the number of atoms in the universe. Except that's not how population growth works. Read some Malthus sometime. A population can't grow very much past the available food supply, and it definitely can't grow beyond its supply of atoms. Being able to manipulate the numbers so that you can show that a very, very simplistic calculation leads to roughly the answer you're looking for isn't actually evidence of anything. Well, maybe it's evidence of the fact that you were convinced by some of the worst creationist ideas imaginable, but it's not evidence for anything related to the age of the Earth, for or against.
If man's been here for millions of years, why aren't there a whole lot more people? Population is a great indicator that man has not been here for millions of years.
Food supply, disease, war, infant mortality, etc. The population of the Earth has grown more in the last 50 years than it had in the previous 10,000 years, mostly due to medical advances. A common misconception about the past is that people only lived to be about 30 years old, because the average age was around 30 for a good chunk of human history. But the reason the average is so low, because out of every 6 children that a woman had, only 2 on average would survive into adulthood, and that was the average number of children that a woman would have in her life prior to the 19th century. Generally speaking, obviously over a long period of time, that number will vary. Once a person reached adulthood, the average life expectancy was between 50 and 60 years. So, since the average woman has 6 kids in her life, and on average of those 6 only 2 survive into adulthood, then the population won't grow very much. The survival rate was actually a tiny bit more than 2, so there was growth, but very slow growth. Then, the population shot up pretty quickly once we made enough medical advances that kids could survive to adulthood, because there were a couple generations where it was still the norm to have a bunch of kids, but the kids were all surviving now. So yeah, the only reason the population is as big as it is now is because of advances in medical and agricultural technology. Otherwise the population of the Earth would likely still be crawling along at just over 1 billion people, with people having to have extra kids to make up for all the ones that would die.
When you look at the genetic load that's increasing in the gene pool of people, you say, wow, this can't have been going on for a long time, not millions of years.
Okay, that one sentence there is all that he says about genetic load in this whole video, which was probably a relatively smart decision on his part. This is one of those topics where I feel that if he covers it in greater detail, then it will become even more painfully obvious than normal that he doesn't have a clue what he's talking about. Anyway, genetic load is, put simply, the difference in fitness between 2 genomes. The genome that is less fit can be said to have a higher genetic load. And less fit here is using the evolutionary definition of fitness. It's measured by how many offspring that organism produces. Notably, genetic load is a relative measurement. You need a baseline to compare it to, and usually the baseline will be the genome of a particularly fit individual, where it could be said of a different individual that if they had the same genome as the more fit individual, they would successfully have more offspring, and more of those offspring would survive to reproduction age. Hovind is assuming that the genetic load always increases, and always has a negative impact on the species' overall fitness. This can be the case, and certainly has caused extinction in some species, but it is not necessarily the case. In fact, a high genetic load can lead to more rapid development of beneficial mutations, thereby driving evolution faster than it would in a population with a low genetic load. Genetic loads can also be affected by external factors. If the environment changes such that an allele that was previously selected against is now selected for, then the genetic load switches from the individuals who have that allele to the ones that do not. Think of the Arctic fox. They are very closely related to red foxes. Their common ancestor probably looked more like a red fox than like an Arctic fox, and the red color helped it with camouflage in a number of environments, everything from deserts to forests to meadows. Fun fact, a lot of forest animals are red for camouflage because most forest predators and prey are red-green colorblind. So while a red fox in some green grass might stick out like a sore thumb to most humans, it still works as camouflage against the animals that it is important for them to hide from. Back on topic, if a red fox had a mutation that turned its fur white, this would be a disadvantage in temperate climates for most of the year, causing those foxes to have fewer offspring and giving them a higher genetic load than the average fox. But move them to the Arctic, and suddenly they have an advantage that their red counterparts lack, and so will be more successful, thereby swapping the genetic load from the white foxes to the red ones. So having a high genetic load is not necessarily a bad thing, and can actually serve to speed up evolution, thereby resulting in a lower genetic load down the line.
You can look at the sun. The sun is burning up its fuel source. Obviously, it's burning.
Nope, that's not how fusion works. It's not burning like a fire with it using up its fuel by combusting it with the air in space.
But in space, wouldn't it be a different scenario based on the fact that, the the space and the air in the space is much different than the air we have here.
Rather, it is fusing its material. Right now it's fusing hydrogen into helium. Well, that's overly simplistic. There are actually 4 potential fusion pathways that lead from hydrogen and end at helium, but that's beyond the scope of this video. My point is, it begins with hydrogen, and at the end of one of these 4 fusion pathways, we have helium. The helium produced has slightly less mass than the hydrogen that produced it, and the extra mass is released in accordance with the E=mc² formula. And that's how we get energy here on Earth. So it's not burning up its fuel, it's fusing it into a different type of fuel that it will use in the future.
And it's shrinking because of its burning up its fuel. And it is not only shrinking, it is throwing off 5 million tons a second. It's losing weight.
Wow, good job, Kent. You did better than Matt did in his video game rant video.
They come out and they just openly say, oh yeah, the sun is burning up 250 tons a second.
Well, actually, from having watched his discussion with Jackson Wheat, which led to the air and space comment, he is at least aware of my video where I point out just how wrong he was when he said that it burns up 250 tons per second. So maybe Hovind got this one right because Matt actually learned something from me. Maybe not, but it's possible. Okay, on to the main point. The sun is not shrinking. Intuitively, yeah, we'd think losing mass equals shrinking, but the sun doesn't operate intuitively. As it loses mass, it will actually begin expanding. But even if that were how it operated, the amount of mass it has lost in its 4.5 billion year history is tiny compared with its overall mass. It has lost about the mass of Saturn since its formation, which, yeah, that's a lot of mass. Saturn is huge, but as huge as Saturn is, it's still tiny compared to the Sun. Saturn only has 0.03% of the mass of the Sun. The Sun is estimated to last another 5 billion years or so before entering its red giant stage, where the fusion of helium will begin. At its current rate of fusion, that would mean that it would lose another 0.03% of its mass before that time, meaning that over its 9.5 billion year lifespan, it will lose a grand total of 0.06% of its mass to the whole E=mc² thing. So tell me again how it can't possibly be more than 6,000 years old because it loses too much of its mass.
Well, if your sun's been losing weight for billions of years, if you get back in time in your imagination, the sun would be much heavier, making gravity stronger, sucking all the planets in.
That's not how gravity works. If it were heavier, that would not mean that things would get sucked straight into it. That just means the necessary velocities for maintaining a specific orbit would be different. So maybe the planets were 0.03% closer to the sun than they are today. Yeah, I know that's not how you would do that calculation, but since the distance that the Earth is from the sun varies by about 4% throughout the course of the year, I figure we're within the margin of error here.
You cannot have the fine balance between Earth and sun with there just being in the right habitable zone for millions and billions of years while the sun's losing weight so fast.
I don't see why not. It's not a very big change even over billions of years.
Well, you look at the moon. The moon's going around the Earth, but the moon's getting further away from the Earth. Okay? Well, that means it used to be closer. If you bring the moon back in closer, you get higher tides. And at some point, you get too close and they snap together like two magnets, called the inverse square law.
Nope, that's not how any of that works. First, the recession rate of the moon is not a constant. It's affected by the continental configuration on the Earth, which is also not a constant. Second, the thing that happens when two orbiting bodies get too close together in their orbit is not that they snap together like magnets, but rather that at least one of them will be ripped apart by tidal forces. Third, the distance at which this happens is not called the inverse square law, it's called the Roche limit. The inverse square law simply describes the fact that the force exerted by gravity decreases as two objects are moved further apart, and that decrease happens at an exponential rate. Fourth, if the recession rate of the moon were a constant, like creationists like to pretend that it is, then at its current rate, it would have been a whopping 179,000 kilometers closer to the Earth 4.5 billion years ago, leaving it 205,400 kilometers away from the Earth. The Roche limit for the Earth is 18,400 kilometers. So if the moon was part of the Earth-Moon system right from the very beginning 4.5 billion years ago, then even before any amount of recession, the moon would still be 187,000 kilometers farther away from the Earth than the Roche limit. So you're wrong about the recession rate, you're wrong about how gravity works, and even if you were right about the recession rate, you're wrong about how much closer the moon would be to the Earth.
You can look at the stars in space, you can look at the living things on Earth, and look at the Earth itself. The Earth is spinning, but it slows down.
And once again, this single sentence is all we get for this point. I think he wants us to picture the Earth as a giant centrifuge 4.5 billion years ago, flinging everything off of its surface. Yes, the Earth's rotation is slowing down. Yes, it was faster in the past. As with everything else, though, the creationist calculations on this one are flawed. I'm not going to go into great detail, but suffice it to say for now that the rate at which the Earth's rotation is slowing down is also slowing down, thanks in large part to the tidal forces of the Moon. So that's not an easy one to calculate or guesstimate, but as I've already put significantly more thought into it than Kent apparently has, I'll just leave it here.
I give about 30 different scientific indicators for a young Earth on my seminar part 1.
Of course. Go buy my DVDs to hear more. Well, I've said stuff like this before, and it always seems to come up, but when you're putting together a list like this that is representative of a much larger list, the best thing to do is to make sure that the best items from the longer list are represented in the shorter one. So if Kent followed that principle, then the best he's got are these utterly pathetic arguments that don't hold any water if you even know the tiniest bit about the subjects that he covers. And that's it for this one. Today's comment of the day comes to us from Solon Kezos, who says, "This is a fictional piece of work trying to act like it's science. Evolutionists love to tell stories with zero proof. They also love to quote other evolutionists, as if a story becomes real via a citation of a story." Well, you're welcome to look through the sources I put in my description. Citing scientific research is not just quoting a story. There are experiments, calculations, observations, and more that all support evolution, and I have lots of links to them. Specific to evolution, maybe check out my Evidence for Evolution series, which, as the title implies, comes along with lots of evidence for evolution, if you're willing to actually look through my sources. Thanks for watching. Thanks to this week's PayPal hero, Nyack. I'm sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing that horribly. And special thanks as always to my patrons, iOS Tilt Bill Gamer, Bryn Pound, Clench Eastwood, Lynn Dobbs, Mark McManus, Mark Hetcham, and all the rest, who are the inverse square law that will snap you together with my channel like magnets. If you'd like to actually be the ripping apart of a moon through tidal forces, you can join us on Patreon for as little as $1 per week over at patreon.com/ViceRhino. If you feel so inclined, you can also support the channel through direct donation or my Amazon wishlist. Links to social media, all the ways to support the channel, and to my other projects like my podcast with my daughter can be found at links.vicerhino.com. If for whatever reason you want to send me stuff, my P.O. Box address is in the description. See you next time!